Welcome to episode number 4 of this new watercolor series on my channel called 30 Things to Know When Starting Watercolor. If you've missed any of the previous episodes in this series or are just brand new here, I'll provide a link below to a playlist that will get you all caught up. In today's episode, we will be discussing palettes. This is probably one of the easiest and most recognizable supplies for watercolor. But since it is so recognizable and so familiar to us, sometimes we forget that this is actually where the magic really happens. You see, watercolor is all about water control, which actually starts in your palette. So my question to you is, have you ever placed paint in your palette only to see it soak up in this strange bead-like substance and try and paint with this? Well, this absorbing droplet mess you see here is very bad. I'll explain why later on in this video, but before we tackle the really cool secrets hidden within our watercolor palette, let's do a brief overview of the ins and outs of watercolor palettes. So without further ado, let's jump into this. When looking at watercolor palettes, they are classified in 3 ways: setup, size, and material. Let's talk about setup first. One thing that all watercolor palettes have in common is that their mixing surface is always white. The reason for this is pretty simple and self-explanatory. You see, a white surface will help you when mixing colors to gauge whether you have the correct color hue or not. The next way palettes are set up is with wells and mixing areas. Wells are referring to the place where you actually store your paint. Deeper, larger wells tend to be preferred by watercolor artists since it allows you to dip larger brushes into the well and retrieve more paint. Mixing areas, as you guessed it, is where you mix your paint. Some palettes have one large mixing area with a large number of individual wells located around the border. And then other palettes have 2 to 5 larger mixing areas with wells located along the sides. The reason for this is really based on the artist's preference for painting. To figure this out, let me ask you some questions. Do you like to work on one large open area without boundaries when you're mixing your colors? Or do you prefer to keep your color mixtures sorted by color families, such as yellows and browns in one mixing area, greens in another, reds in another, and then, of course, blues and purples in a completely different mixing area? Depending on how you answered this question will determine what palette setup you would actually prefer best. The next classification is size. The smaller the size of your watercolor palette, as one would guess, the easier it is to transport from place to place or to paint outside of your home. The cons to this comes to how small your palette actually is. This can make it difficult to mix paints and even store larger amounts of paints in your wells. Medium to large watercolor palettes usually have large mixing areas and larger wells to store your paints. But as you guessed, these palettes can become overwhelming when traveling. Also, larger palettes tend to allow you to store a lot of colors in one palette, which can be a good thing, but also a problem for noobs at watercolor. Here's a little tip for you. In order to achieve really bright, vibrant watercolor paintings, you really need to learn how to work with a limited color palette of 10 colors or less. By working with a limited color palette, your colors are less likely to become muddy and thus making your illustration more vibrant in the end. The last way we sort palettes is by material. Watercolor palettes are sold in plastic, porcelain, and metal. For today's video, however, I'm only going to be talking about the 2 that I've come in contact with, which is plastic and porcelain. Plastic palettes are the least expensive option and most widely available. The downside to them is that plastic tends to not allow the paint and water to mix or gel well together. This is actually a huge hindrance when you are learning to mix watercolors and even use them. Your paint should kind of sit on top of the palette rather than coming apart into these little beadlets, as I mentioned earlier. This is why many professional artists, they work with porcelain palettes, which now leads us to our next option. Porcelain palettes, as I'm sure you would expect, are more expensive due to the quality of material being used. Unlike plastic, porcelain allows the artist to work with their water and paint in a well-controlled manner, where it sits on the surface and sticks together, allowing you to get a better read of your mixing and also the amount of paint you actually just created. Now, to get to the meat of this video and why you probably came here in the first place, what palette should you use? As you probably guessed, I didn't show you a porcelain palette, so I actually don't own a porcelain palette. I have used one in the past, but I don't have one currently. The palette that I use and I recommend is this plastic palette that I got from Amazon for under $10. And yep, you heard me right, $10. Of course, one day I would like to invest in a porcelain palette, but for now I'm just gonna make do with my plastic palette that has seen me through all these years. All right, now you're probably wondering, since you're using a plastic palette, Carrie, how did you fix the problem of mixing and your paint and water pulling apart? Well, there are two ways to fix this. The first way is by mixing your paints on a porcelain plate from your kitchen that you're never going to use again. But I have done this for years and it has worked tremendously for me. The con to this is, once again, you have just one large mixing area, so you really have to pay attention to how you're mixing your paints on this plate. The second option, which I actually just ran across a couple weeks ago, is to spray enamel paint, that's spray paint, on the inside of your plastic paint palette. And as you can see, this helps loosen up the paint and allows it to pull in your mixing areas the way it should. These are both really cheap options for plastic palettes that can help you get the most out of your mixing and when you're using your paint. So I hope this cleared up some things for you and perhaps you learned something new. Of course, if you want to learn some more helpful insider tips about supplies or watercolor in general, make sure to sign up for my weekly newsletter. The link is provided below. And as always, y'all, it's been a pleasure and I will see you next time.